Alerts are a common feature in many products. They're a specific type of notification that draws a user's attention to an event or particular state in your product so that they can stay informed and take action if needed. But like most notifications, alerting features work best when the user can exercise choice about who gets alerted, which events trigger alerts, which channels those alerts are delivered to, and when those alerts get sent. In this video, we'll look at how to create an alerting workflow in Knock that puts the user in control. We'll cover how to use alerts stored in your system to trigger workflows, how to model alerts directly in Knock using objects and subscriptions, and then we'll look at how you can use a single workflow to model all of these choices. So let's get started. Okay, so let's spend a few minutes getting our example application configured. In this guide video, we'll be following the written instructions that you can find in this guide that's a part of the guide section of the Knock docs. Now, what we'll do is we're going to walk through all of the examples today using this example app that you can find linked at the top of this guide. And you can start off by cloning this down locally, and then we'll need to provide a couple of configuration details to get going. So I've already actually cloned this locally. And so if I hop into VS Code, the first thing that we're going to want to do is make a copy of our sample environment file. So we'll cp.env.sample into .env.local. And then we'll go ahead and get a couple of these values. So we'll need our Knock API key, which is a secret key. Then we'll need to establish an object collection for our alerts, and then establish a workflow key for the alert workflow that will trigger. So first thing, let's hop back into the Knock dashboard, and we will come down to API keys, and we can go ahead and grab our secret key here. And we'll just paste that into our env file. Now for these other two options, I'm just going to leave them as the default, and that's totally fine. But you could change the name of the alert collection or the name of the workflow key to whatever you want. So there's one other step that I want to run us through. So we've got sort of the example app set up and ready to go, but we'll also want to include the workflow that we can use as an example. And there are two ways that we can do that. So if we hop back into the Knock dashboard and navigate into the workflows page, if we come over to create workflow, you can come down to view templates to view our template gallery. And so what we've done here is we've created a workflow that corresponds to this example app under this alert workflow. So you can see what that looks like here. And if you wanted to clone this, we could just provide this a name of alert and click create workflow. So that's one option. And so if you haven't used the CLI yet, this is probably your easy option. The other option, which I'll show you now, is that I've also included the steps of this particular workflow inside of this Knock folder. So if we cd into this Knock folder, we can actually open that up and see what that looks like. We can see in there that we've got this alert folder. And that has all of the different email templates, the workflow JSON to describe the workflow. So basically everything that you would need to push this workflow directly to Knock. And so we could do that by running Knock workflow push alert to target the alert folder. And then we're going to do -- commit. And then we'll pass in a commit message of initial commit. And so we'll go ahead and run this. Knock is going to validate it for us. Go ahead and push that into our dashboard. And so if we come back here and we can see we've got our alert workflow uploaded for us pretty immediately. So that's a great introduction to the Knock CLI. I'm not going to go through that in depth in this tutorial, but it's a great way to store some of your resources in your code base. And work with that stuff in code if you want to do that. You could also, obviously for this guide, you could just use the template gallery clone option. So I'll go ahead and cd back into my main directory. I want to run npm install first to install all of our dependencies. And then we'll go ahead and run npm run dev. to start our application on localhost 3000. If we open it up, we can see that this is what it looks like. Right now we don't have any alerts, so we'll go ahead and need to create an alert in the next step. So stay tuned. Before we get too deep into talking about how to model alerts using Knock's objects and subscriptions, I wanted to talk for a second about the pros and cons of modeling alerts in your own system. So if you look at the code sample on screen here, you'll see that we have just a JavaScript variable called alert, where we're storing an ID, an array of different supported channels, an array of different supported events, an array of recipients, and then a batch window object that might tell us when and how we would batch messages sent for this particular alert. Now, after that, we can use that object, which could be stored entirely in your database, and just pass all of that data into Knock like we were triggering any other workflow. So I think that's an important thing to take away from this guide, is that there's a lot of choice in how you decide to model this. And for some use cases, you may want to keep a bunch of your data or most of your data in your system and just use Knock to trigger the actual workflow itself. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, you do gain some benefit by switching to Knock with objects and subscriptions, but again, then you're sort of having to write data to a secondary system. So depending on how tight sort of your subscription lists are coupled with your organizational model, there's trade-offs that you'll need to make with either approach. So definitely worth calling out here that if you want to model an alert entirely in your database and you select from this alert table and you get an object that looks like this, that's entirely valid as well. What we'll show in the subsequent steps of this guide is how you could offload more of that to Knock, although there is no sort of one-size-fits-all recommendation, entirely up to your use case. Okay, so now that we've talked about the pros and cons of modeling resources in Knock versus just using data stored in your system, let's configure some alerts using Knock objects. So the first thing I'll do here in my example app is click this Add Alert button, which is going to take me to a new alert form. In here, we've already generated a unique ID, so we'll just keep that. And here we can add a description. And then below that, we have some options. And now it's really best practice when you're creating notification experiences inside of your product to give users as much control as possible. So here we're allowing them to select which events they want to subscribe to. And I'll just leave all three of these selected. And then we're also allowing them to select which channels they want to be notified on. So I'm actually going to remove SMS from this example. And then below that, we also give them the ability to determine what frequency they want to be notified at. So we have immediately, and then we have two batch options that are going to boil down to batch windows of daily or weekly. And so I'll leave this as immediately for now. And then we also have the option to basically manage our recipient or our subscriber list through this interface. So here I can click manage and we'll go ahead and select a subscriber, and then we'll go ahead and click submit. And this is going to create us in a new alert. And then we can come back to this alerts overview page. And if we wanted to come back and edit that, we could do it. But we also have this mechanism up here to test events. And so if we want to send a test event, we can do that. But before we do that, let's actually hop into our code base and into Knock real quick to just sort of examine what we did under the hood as we created this alert. So as we created this alert, we created an object inside of this alerts collection using this ID, right? So objects in Knock are collections that have individual entities that have a unique ID. And then on that individual object, we can store custom properties. So we can use those custom properties to drive some of our downstream notification logic. And now if I came back, for example, let's actually go ahead and update this. And let's say we wanted to change the batch option from immediately to daily. We can go ahead and update that. And then if we refresh our alert there, we can see that now instead of having null as our batch window, we have this object. The frequency has changed. So a very interesting way that you can store some of this data in Knock. And I'm going to go ahead and flip this back to immediately just for the purposes of our guide. So that's essentially what we're doing in Knock. And then we'll use that object in a couple of places when we trigger the workflow to pass that data in. Now let's actually jump back into the code base real quick and see where that's happening. So a bunch of this logic is powered by this set alert form, which is a form that basically handles updating or creating that object in Knock. And here we can see a bunch of those properties like ID, description, events is an array, channels is an array, batch window is a possible null object, things like that. So this is basically just a React form, and there's not a ton of Knock specific logic in here. But what we do is when we actually submit that form, we're going to run a server action to set that alert object. And so essentially what we do is we take the values of the form and we're just going to call Knock object set and pass in the collection and the ID. And then we set all of these individual properties, and basically we're just updating those each time we want to do that. Right? So that sets the alert. Now let's hop back into Knock real quick and look at one more thing. So on each object, there's also this concept of subscriptions. Now, subscription is a relationship between a user in Knock and an object. And what that means is that when we trigger our workflow, we can pass in just the object, and then Knock will handle fanning out to all of the subscribers to that object. So it's a way of us basically encoding that subscription logic onto this object, and then it allows us to simplify how we trigger that workflow, right? In the previous example where everything was stored in your code base, you had to store a list of recipients, you had to go fetch them, and then obviously pass them into that workflow trigger. Now there are some limitations on that workflow trigger, being that you can't trigger a workflow for more than 1,000 recipients at one time. So it does become advantageous to do this when you're managing very large lists of subscribers. So we can see that that subscription is here. And so if we hop back into our example code, this is where we manage those subscriptions. So basically we have sort of two values that we're passing into this server action, where we're keeping track of the recipients that were added during, the editing session and the ones that were removed. So we're just making sure that we update that subscription list each time somebody is added or removed. So here you can see we're deleting some subscriptions, then we're adding some subscriptions for any of the people who were added during that editing session, right? So that's how we sort of handle modeling those values in Knock itself. And then let's go ahead and test our alert and then walk through our workflow in the next step. So let's go ahead and test the alert actually. So we'll come back out to our application. Here we've only got this one option for an alert. So we can go to test events. We'll select the alert that we want to test, and we'll select the event that we want to send. And we'll go ahead and send that. And then if we hop into Knock, come into our alert workflow and go to workflow runs, we should see that we've got these two very recent runs. And when we trigger a workflow for an object recipient, Knock will process that workflow run for the object itself and then all of its subscribers. So that's why you sort of see these two options here. And if we go into this one right here, we can sort of actually follow the path that it took to send that workflow. So we'll pause here and hop back into the code base so that I can show you how we're triggering that workflow. And we've got this test event form inside of our test event form component that is just a form that, decides we select which alert we want to trigger, which event, and then we're going to trigger this server action here, which is just triggering a workflow. So the first thing we're going to do is actually get the details of that object, right? So that we can pass some of that data into the workflow trigger. And we do that here, where we're going to go ahead and trigger our alert as using the process.env value that we specified earlier. Here we're passing in just the object as a recipient, right? So this is our alert ID. We're passing the collection. And then here we're passing in some data about the alert. We've got this alert object, and then we're spreading all of its properties into there. And then we're passing in the event type that we selected in our form. And then that triggers the workflow in Knock, which generated the workflow recipient runs that we just saw. And then in the next step, we'll go ahead and walk through this workflow in detail to show you what that could look like. So now that we have this recipient run, let's go ahead and walk through the individual steps of this example alerting workflow to see how we can use Knock to power a bunch of this logic, right? So in this example here, when somebody configures an alert, they have all these different options that they can select. And then we basically have encoded, the when, where, and how to send that notification directly into Knock itself. And so we can illustrate that really nicely using the execution logs for this workflow run. So you can see here that we started with this trigger step. And if we click on that, we'll see that we have some conditions that we added to it. So what we're doing here is this is called a trigger condition. And this is a condition that exists on the trigger. So this is a really useful way if we want to exit a workflow run quickly if a certain condition isn't met. So when we created our alert, we basically said, hey, I want you to decide which events you want to subscribe to. So we've got that array right here. And that's all that we're doing here is we're checking, is this alert subscribed to the particular event that we're triggering? So does data.alert.events contain data.event, right? Does the alert object contain the event that we just triggered? And if it does, we continue. If it doesn't, it immediately exits the workflow so that none of the subsequent steps are met. Right after that, we have this branch step, and this is a branch step that looks at a batch window. And so if it's null, meaning we've decided that we want this notification set sent immediately, it's going to go to the left-hand side. If not, it's going to go to this right-hand side and open up a batch. So from here, we have a bunch of channel steps. So we see SendGrid, in-app, and Twilio. And each one of these has a condition, and we can see that some of them are completed and some of them haven't been met. So if we click on SendGrid, we're doing something similar to what we did up here on our trigger step, where we're looking at the alerts configured channels to see whether or not it contains email. And so we can see there that we've selected email and in-app, so it obviously sends that message. Same with in-app, but when we get down to Twilio, we can see that channels array does not contain SMS, so it doesn't actually execute that one. And now let's go ahead and I'm going to switch back over here, modify our alert slightly, and we'll change this frequency from immediately to daily. And then we'll go ahead and trigger another test event. Go ahead and fire off another alert. And now what should happen is when we examine these workflow runs, yes, we can see that this behavior is slightly different. So if we click into this recipient workflow run, we can see that instead of being completed, it's processing. And then our sort of trace through these steps is slightly different. So we've got the trigger still, we've got the branch. And so obviously this time batch window is not null, it's an object. And so we're going to proceed to the batch. And what this does is it actually opens up this batch for us. And then we use the information stored in this batch window rule, which is a Knock specific concept to power basically how long that batch is going to stay open. And so you can see that that's on the batch there. And so if we were to say fire off a couple of different events, we can see that if we come back into our workflow run, we'll refresh this and this one's still going to stay processing. But then a bunch of those subsequent notifications to that individual recipient are completed. And if we come down here, we can see that, it's because they've been added to that already open batch. So again, a really interesting look at how you can use the workflow run debugger to sort of look at the logic of individual workflow runs and figure out sort of how your users are getting notifications. Before we end, let's head back into this particular alert and sort of just walk through what's happening one more time. So I'm going to go ahead and click Edit Steps to bring me to the Workflow Editor canvas. And again, we've got this trigger condition on our trigger that's basically looking at the configured events for that alert and exiting if we're not triggering an alert that matches that condition. From there, we proceed to a branch that looks at whether or not we have a batch window configured. If we don't and it's null, then we proceed to sending these channel steps immediately as long as those channels are configured as well. If not, we head into this batch branch where we source our batch window rules directly from our data. So we're storing that so that it's configurable by the user. And then after that, we will still do the same thing, right? Each one of these channel steps is still going to look at the configured channels to decide whether or not it should send a message on those channels. So again, this is just a sort of generic or possibly one option for creating an alerting type workflow. But if we go back to the code example that we looked at that was sourcing the alert data from your own system, an alert really is just another type of workflow that is triggered under particular conditions. And again, it's best practice when you're providing these sort of notification experiences for your end users to make them as configurable as possible, as we've seen with this form. So again, this gives the user a lot of control to determine when, where, and how, and to whom these notifications are sent. And ultimately that creates a better end user experience. Awesome. Thanks for watching. While alerts can seem special, they are, after all, just another type of notification sent under particular conditions. Hopefully, after watching this video, you have a better understanding of how Knock can help you with this use case. Whether you want to model alerts in your own system or offload part of that to Knock's primitives, the patterns we've outlined here around providing users configuration options are definitely best practice, and these can be easily expressed using Knock's workflow editor. If you have any questions as you get started, don't hesitate to reach out to us on Slack or drop a comment on this video. Thanks for watching, and knock on.